Freedom Report, we are going to bring you an update on Kratom legality across the United States of America. This won't be comprehensive, but we're going to hit some of the bigger things and bigger changes that have been taking place in the country. We're going to start with the federal level and then go on to the states. And again, the Health Freedom Report and the Live Free Now program where we produce the Health Freedom Report is brought to you by Brave Botanicals. Check out mybravebotanicals.com. We recently launched a new product, colloidal silver, 20 parts per million, antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal. This stuff works great. I recently used it. I had what seemed like a cold coming on. I had some pain in my throat, hurt to swallow. I nebulized colloidal silver with this device right here, and the next afternoon, it was all cleared up. I'm not a doctor. These statements aren't approved by the FDA. Brave Botanicals colloidal silver is not intended to cure, diagnose, prevent, or treat any disease or illness. I'm just giving you my own 2 cents, and man, it sure as heck does help me. So check it out at mybravebotanicals.com. All right, for the Health Freedom Report, let's start at the federal level. First of all, let's start, if people viewing aren't familiar with Kratom. What is Kratom? Kratom is made from the powderized leaves of the Kratom evergreen tree. You can see some Kratom kilos and half kilos packaged in their raw form there behind me. It's grown primarily in Southeast Asia. It's been used for centuries as a folk remedy or as a way to take the edge off for laborers out in the fields. And it's recently become popular in the West for its help with pain relief, anti-anxiety, anti-stress, depression, sleeping. Other strains like the green, white, and yellows. The reds are good for pain, have more of a sedative effect. The green, white, and yellows are good for energy, mental focus. And it's just exploding in popularity, and a large part is because in America, there is one hell of an opioid problem. There are so many people that are addicted to opioids like Oxycontin, Vicodin, Percocet, and a lot of people too that are addicted to opiates like heroin. And this is a big problem. And wouldn't you know it, when people decide that they want to quit that addiction, they want to get sober, it's ruining their lives, they can't play with their kids, they're all jacked up ever since they got that accident or ever since they had that trauma in their life. People have found that they can drink Kratom and it helps dramatically to reduce the withdrawal symptoms, enabling them to liberate themselves from the clutches of addiction, which I think is a mighty fine thing. Well, Kratom is estimated to do $5 billion in revenue every year. And I saw some statistic that the opioid industry does $25 billion. So that's actually a pretty good chunk of competition. And if you are familiar with how government works, there's something called the revolving door, where big industries, in this case, the pharmaceutical industries, buddy up with politicians and regulators. And oftentimes, former executives become regulators. Former regulators become executives. And what they do is they help one another out. They weed out competition so that the bigger firms can thrive. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't realized this, you're not paying attention. This is how the system works. That's how everything's all jacked up. And for people to say, we need to fix the government's not operating as it should. It's not for the people. It's operating exactly as it should be, because this is how government has worked since the get-go, even since the founding of this country and other countries and governments before. The purpose isn't to benefit the masses. It's to benefit the few at the expense of the many. And that's exactly what we see taking place with the federal government and the state government. Now, some people have positive intentions, as we'll explore, but at the end of the day, that's what I believe the intention of the Food and Drug Administration. And you just take a look at Scott Gottlieb, the FDA chairman or commissioner's background, and he's been heavily involved in the pharmaceutical industry, even investment firms that invest in pharmaceutical industries. So let's get caught up on what's going on at the federal level. The DEA in 2016, December, tried to emergency schedule Kratom. They got pushed back by like 50 congressmen and 10 U.S. senators, and they ended up backing away from that. And ever since then, what's taken place is they pulled back. They asked the Food and Drug Administration if they would study Kratom, give them their recommendation, and then maybe we'll go through the normal scheduling process. We've been in a holding period. There have been more comment periods taking place for the DEA, but that's where we're at. And ever since then, the FDA has been engaged in a massive propaganda campaign we're going to talk more about here in a second. But there's a great update from the American Kratom Association. Mac Haddo, their legislative director, they recently held a webinar, and the webinar was called What Do We Do If Kratom is Scheduled? And in that webinar, they announced that they are pretty certain that the DEA is not going to schedule Kratom. Let me read this out. This is from one of their updates. Matt Caddo, legislative director of AKA, assured the Kratom community that there is no imminent threat of the DEA declaring Kratom a Schedule I substance, which would outlaw Kratom. We went through this process in 2016 when the DEA first attempted to schedule Kratom, reversed its decision, and in Haddow's words, felt abused by the FDA that they did not go through the proper procedures for recommending a ban. And so here's what happened. Here's what would happen if the DEA did, in the off chance, schedule Kratom. If the DEA were to schedule Kratom, there would first be a federal register notice, which would give the DEA 30 days to ban Kratom and would allow for a comment period. During this time, an interested party can request a public hearing, which would be heard by a DEA administrative law judge. According to the AKA, this process could take 4 to 18 months. The judge would make a decision, and then the final order would be issued by the DEA. So that's where we're at with the Drug Enforcement Agency, which at one point was the biggest threat to Kratom. Now, since then, there has been an act, the STITSA Act, the Stop the Importation and Trafficking of Synthetic Analogs Act. Synthetic analogs are stuff like spice and synthetic opioids or synthetic alkaloids that get you high, basically. And there was a fear that some of the language could encompass Kratom. The STITSA Act would have given the DEA the ability to create this new class of schedules called Schedule A. A new category of drugs, Schedule A. And right now there's Schedules 1 through 5, I believe. And Schedule A, they could have added Kratom willy-nilly. There's not a lot of overview. It basically gives a lot of leeway to the DEA to add things to this new schedule. Now, this didn't pass. It passed through the House, I believe, but it never passed the Senate. And so there was a lot of pushback from the American Kratom Association. There was a lot of pushback from people like you that may have called or wrote your congressperson. And at this point, while it did pass the House, it has not passed the Senate. So give a little sigh of relief for that. Now, as I said, the FDA, ever since 2016, when they realized that they weren't going to get what they want, they have stepped up their propaganda campaign full scale. Scott Gottlieb, the director of the FDA, has been doing interviews, putting out press releases. This is something that they do, and it's really indicative of how, what do they call it, the fourth branch of government, the media works, right? It's this mainstream media, the fake news. Scott Gottlieb will put out a press release saying Kratom-related deaths are like 36 or 44, right? This isn't backed up by reality, because when you go explore, which was got by open records request, the actual deaths, most of the people have other substances in their system, like fentanyl. One guy was shot. One guy fell off a roof. And because they had Kratom in their system, the FDA puts out a press release saying these Kratom-related deaths. And then what happens? The parrot media repeats it all as though it's fact, and they continue to do what they do. Maybe they move up more when they don't shake the boat in the media, local news channels, local newspapers, Washington Post, Forbes.com, CNN, New York Times, you name it. Although New York Times did recently have a very favorable piece. We share it on My Brave Botanicals Facebook page. But they just simply repeat it and regurgitate it. And then my mom, who helps me with the Kratom trade, has friends that are like, oh, I just heard on Dr. Oz that Kratom's being mixed with all sorts of nasty stuff and spice. And I heard that Kratom has all these heavy metals. That was another thing they said. Kratom found to have heavy metals, and turns out they tested 5 or 25 ones that were confiscated. They didn't go out and say, okay, we're going to do a random test of 1,000 different vendors or 100 different vendors and see how many of them have heavy metals. And the headline is, Kratom found with heavy metal scare in Kratom. This is what's taking place, and it really makes it hard to work uphill. But for those in the Kratom industry, I just want to point out something that Seth Godin, who's a marketing whiz, talks about. My market for Kratom isn't people that listen to CNN. It isn't even people that take their doctor's word as gospel. It's for alternative thinkers, people that question authority, people that think for themselves. That's my core audience. And so the fact that the FDA is railing on it, and there's all these articles in the local CBS affiliate, it doesn't really slow things down, because people are still waking up and people are still finding that this simple little powder is benefiting them immensely, and they're still going for it, even though the FDA is pushing all sorts of lies and propaganda. Take a propagander at this propaganda. Yeehaw, boy. So another thing that's taken place with the FDA is they've stepped up their importation seizures. They recently, in 2016, they put out an importation alert. In 2011 or 2012, they put out an importation alert. And this basically instructs the Customs and Border Patrol to seize products that have Michigrania speciosa on the labels. Most of these are coming from Indonesia. And recently there was a bit of a hit, and my own supply chain took a little bit of a hit. Now here's the thing: and then the American Kratom Association put out what I thought was a little bit of alarming headlines, and I personally think that they were doing it to drum up fundraising effort. But I don't know what their exact intentions were. But it was true. There was a step up in the importations and seizures that were taking place. And really, it sorts out the solid creative entrepreneurs from the ones that are just like, oh, well, what are we going to do? Because certain suppliers that I'm familiar with, they simply found ways to circumvent the status quo, found new ways into the country, found new channels for shipping that weren't using the existing channels that are now being more heavily scrutinized. And the flow of Kratom continues on into the country. It's not illegal. That's what's been going on with the FDA lately, and they're not going to let up. Another thing that they've been doing is they've been saying, well, we don't really have much of a shot with the DEA now, so let's go directly to state pharmacy boards, to state departments of health and human service, and let's try to push some legislation through. In 2017, there was a bill in Illinois that would have banned Kratom. Thankfully, because of the work from the American Kratom Association and activists like you, that ended up being watered down and just merely a prohibition from people that are 18 years or younger from purchasing Kratom. Now, yes, this is an empty victory in my opinion. Kratom was legal beforehand, and it was a compromise. But in my opinion, people that are 16, 17, even like 13, 14, or 15, they should be able to consume a freaking plant, people. It's just powder, especially if it's someone that has ADD, for example, or has difficulty studying, or someone that's extremely depressed and they're on serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or they're on tranquilizers, or they're on Ritalin or Adderall. It would be much preferable for a 10-year-old, 13-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old to be taking Kratom instead. So, it's better than it being outright banned, of course, and that's what's taking place. You get charged $500 if you sell to a minor, maybe if you possess as well. Provides that knowing sale, buying, or distributing samples or finished product of anyone containing quantity is a Class B misdemeanor. Okay. There's also a city called Jerseyville in Illinois that made it illegal. Who wants to go to Jerseyville anyway? Georgia's recently had some headlines too. The American Kratom Association encouraged people to participate in a December 2018 hearing. There was a bill in 2016 to try to ban Kratom. They kicked it down the road, and instead they studied it. Apparently things are looking good in Georgia. I reached out to the American Kratom Association to get some feedback on what's taking place with that, and they have not responded. There is no new news. But usually the American Kratom Association is so compelling, and when some of these state lawmakers are decent human beings that are reasonable, they make the right decision when they hear from people that lives have been changed because of Kratom, and when they hear from scientists, and when they hear from these legitimate Kratom lobbyists. They do the right thing, so I feel good about Georgia. Tennessee had some great news in 2018. This was October of 2018. A bill had been passed previously in Tennessee that outlawed synthetic opioids, synthetic analogs, right? And one thing that I learned from this talk, I forget the name of the doctor. Let me see, this awesome doctor in Florida that's doing great work. What is his name? Dr. Christopher McCurdy. I watched this awesome interview that he did with Dr. Oz. Not Dr. Oz. That guy's a jerk. Dr. Mercola. It's an amazing interview he did, and one of the insights that he gave me, because it's like, oh, well, my original idea was like, well, the FDA and all these big pharmaceutical companies must be getting to these state legislatures that have banned Kratom, because there's 6 of them now that have banned Kratom. Alabama, Rhode Island, Vermont, Michigan, I think. There's 2 others. And I was like, man, there must be some corruption going on. But really what I think took place is Kratom, and this is what Dr. McCurdy says, Kratom got lumped in with the spice and the K2 and these synthetic things that really are pretty harmful. I'm a total libertarian anarchist guy, and I think it should all be legal personally. But they banned it, and because when they go to the head shops, you'd see the K2 and the spice and then the Kratom next door. They just assumed Kratom was part of that. But Kratom's not part of that. It's not a chemical. It's totally natural in its raw form. And so what happened in Tennessee is a bill was passed banning all that stuff, lumping in Kratom, but it talked about synthetic versions of this stuff, synthetic analogs, synthetic opioids. And so people in Tennessee were like, oh, I don't know. And there were people, the law enforcement was even going against Kratom people. There's this one guy that was selling Kratom. He went to jail, was later dismissed. Somebody must have written an opinion letter seeking an opinion from the Attorney General and asked him, hey, what's going on? And in October 2018, the Attorney General of Tennessee did the right thing, according to the law, when he stated that possession of the kratom plant in its natural botanical form should not subject a person to potential criminal prosecution under Tennessee state law. The kratom plant in its natural botanical form is not a prohibited controlled substance under Tennessee law. Good news. The right thing prevailed. So that happened in October 2018 in Tennessee, and that's some great news. Ohio was under the gun recently. And thanks to the American Kratom Association, going to this Ohio Board of Pharmacy, the proposed ban on kratom has been tabled for further study. The executive director of the Board of Pharmacy told the board about the thousands of comments received during the comment period and mentioned that more than 450 emails were received yesterday. This was an announcement from the American Kratom Association, who's going to continue to work with Ohio lobbyists and Ohio officials to make certain there's a clear understanding of the science on kratom and its safe use. We deeply appreciate everyone who helped us work with the Board of Pharmacy and look forward to continuing those efforts. So there's some great news coming out of Ohio. Again, the truth wins out when you have decent legislators that aren't looking to harm anyone or take anyone's medicine away. It's good news, guys. This is good stuff. Hope you're enjoying this Health Freedom Report. We got a little bit more to share for you. This is a story from mybrainbotanicals.com. Proposed Utah legislation would keep kratom legal. Now, in Utah, there's a bill that, unlike bills to ban kratom, would keep kratom legal. And I believe this was a proactive measure that was furthered by an American Kratom Association lobbyist, Mac Haddow. Now, for this one, it's bittersweet, because not only would it keep kratom legal, but it would also regulate kratom. Now, as a libertarian-leaning anarchist, I believe that the market provides the best regulation out there, and when there's bad actors, they are found out and they are rooted out. I believe also there's industry associations and trade associations like the Non-GMO Project, for example. You don't need the legislation that says no GMOs in grocery stores. You simply come up with voluntary associations where you stick a non-GMO label on it, and now they grow in popularity. Ideally, more people are using those products. The same thing could take place in the kratom industry. But whenever you introduce regulations, it just opens the door for further regulation, further control, and it creates a spot for language to eventually ban kratom or make it harder to sell. It also increases prices. But this bill would essentially legalize kratom. It would put in labeling requirements. One thing that I thought was a little bit onerous is that it would require a limit to the alkaloid concentration of 7-hydroxymitragynine to no higher than 2%, which means that the alkaloid content and concentration would need to be tested, I guess, for every single batch. So they are requiring less than 2% of one of the main alkaloids in the plant. I believe that the reason for this is just an assumption, is because of the work of Dr. Christopher McCurdy. They found that 7-hydroxymitragynine tends to be the alkaloid that's more addictive. And doing studies on rats, for example, without the 7-hydroxymitragynine and only the mitragynine, they found that it was not as addictive. And so maybe that's why. Maybe they are trying to make the kratom, ensure that the kratom is safer. But again, when we add these regulations, sometimes they're a little onerous, sometimes they are a slippery slope that lead to more problems, sometimes they lead to outright bans, but at least it's much better than having it be prohibited altogether. And again, I'm a free market guy. I prefer no regulation whatsoever. I think the government should step out of it and markets can regulate themselves. This takes place often. Communication, the internet is a great tool. There's so many different reviews and industry groups on Facebook, for example, where you're like, hey, what's a good vendor? And they announce all these different vendors that are vetted and trusted. So I think it's personal responsibility on part of the consumer and part of the vendor where we can find some harmony without government. However, that being said, having regulation in Utah would certainly be beneficial compared to having the kratom banned outright. Okay, this is John Bush with your Health Freedom Report. Again, this is brought to you by My Brave Botanicals. We offer high-quality kratom and CBD. And in addition to selling kratom, CBD, and now colloidal silver, we are also helping to fight to keep kratom legal and educating people through articles and videos such as this. Check out mybravebotanicals.com.